Hello there, weary listener. Today, we are going to take a little trip back in time, a small but uncomfortable trip. Very uncomfortable. You are going to wake up in Brazil between 1530 and 1549, which is to say, the era when Portugal decided it needed to establish a permanent presence here. Not because they had grand plans, of course, but because France was prowling the coast, and someone in Lisbon finally realized that a simple trading post couldn't hold territory. Spoiler alert, they were right, but they didn't exactly have a plan, and like everything in 16th century Portuguese administration, this settlement arrived more or less ready, with more or less logic, and with people more or less prepared for it. Translating this means improvisation, sweat, and mosquitoes. Many mosquitoes of all sizes, shapes, and intentions. Forget the romantic image of discovery. Here we are talking about damp heat, the wrong clothes, new food that no one knew how to cook, a nature so intense it seemed to laugh in the face of Europeans, and settlements that started with half a dozen crooked houses and a constant buzzing, subtly reminding you that the forest always wins. It was the beginning of colonization, and yes, it was as chaotic as it sounds. And before anyone asks, yes, Cabral passed through here in 1500, but he passed so quickly he didn't even leave an instruction manual. That is why real colonization only began 30 years later, when Portugal finally realized it needed to do something other than just take a look and leave. But before boredom wins, or you get bitten by the first imaginary mosquito, go ahead and leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and comment where you are listening from and what time it is. I always like to know who is trying to sleep while learning about heat, mosquitoes, and questionable administrative decisions. And click the hype button. It helps this colonially tired content reach further. Now, turn off the lights. Let's dive into today's boring story. The day begins without haste, but history insists on moving too fast. Portugal, back in the 16th century, wakes up with a strange sensation, something between "this is ours, right?" and "where is everyone today?" After decades of trading posts operating in remote work mode, a few Portuguese supervising, many indigenous people cutting wood, a few Frenchmen showing up to get in the way, the Crown realizes that perhaps, just perhaps, holding an entire territory with half a dozen coastal warehouses wasn't the most solid strategy in the world. There is nothing like a group of Frenchmen smiling too much on the beach to remind a kingdom that geopolitics exists. The idea then emerges, brilliant like every rushed decision. Let's populate. Just like that in the imperative, without method, without structure, without a budget, populate. Because populate sounds like action, it sounds like strength, it sounds like strategy. In practice, it was a 3-line email sent to the destiny of the future. And this is where you, tired listener, enter the landscape. Imagine an immense coast. Forests that seem to have no end, a climate that starts laughing at the Europeans before they even step off the boat. Portugal looks at all of this and thinks, easy, we can manage this. Spoiler, they couldn't. The first Portuguese stepping here didn't come with a survival manual. They came with faith, crooked tools, and that typical self-confidence of someone who has never seen a real tropical mosquito. The Crown sent expeditions with vague instructions. Populate, enjoy, send news. No one specified what to do with that humid heat that stuck to the skin, or with the thicket that seemed to swallow any attempt at a clearing. It was like asking someone to build a castle using a fork and a candle. Theoretically, does it work? No, and there were still the French. Yes, because while Portugal tried to pretend it was in control, France simply appeared on the coast, especially with the Tupinambá along the shore between Bahia, Espírito Santo, and Rio de Janeiro, with a smile saying, "Bonjour." They brought merchandise, fabrics, tools, and most importantly, a real interest in making friends with native peoples. For Portugal, this was a nightmare. For the natives, it was just Tuesday. For the French, it was a holiday. For you, trying to imagine this chaos, it is just the beginning of the night. The truth is that Portugal needed to act, but acting too fast usually generates something interesting: improvisation. The expeditions from 1530 onwards are exactly that. A mixture of enthusiasm, a lack of planning, and hope that the territory would cooperate. Only the territory did not cooperate. The forest was dense, the soil didn't always obey, the heat was unforgiving, and the insects were just waiting for the human buffet to open. Martim Afonso de Sousa, leading one of the most important expeditions, arrives with that air of someone sent to solve everything in one go, as if commanding an armada along the entire coast was the same as organizing a party with a guest list. He tries to establish order, tries to reconnoiter the terrain, tries to discover who is a friend, who is French, who is an indigenous ally, and who is a forest creature making noise at night. It was too much at once on a continent that wasn't created to make life easy for a tired Portuguese man. And even so, the Crown kept repeating, "We must colonize." The word seemed to solve problems, as if saying colonize automatically created roads, raised houses and tamed mosquitoes. The reality was different. Colonizing meant people sweating, fighting, carrying wood, doing calculations that always turned out wrong, and praying that no storm would wash half the constructions away. Portugal sent orders like someone writing a note, but those on the ground knew the note was much more optimistic than life permitted. And of course, there was always a silent expectation. If it works, great. If it goes wrong, well, we'll think about it later. This is the kind of plan that is born apologizing. Deep down, Portugal didn't exactly want to populate. It wanted to guarantee the territory. Populating was a convenient side effect. The real intention was quite simple: prevent someone more excited, faster, or more organized from stealing it. Why administer? That wasn't on the schedule. Portugal was living through that "I'll fix it later" phase that lasts about 3 decades. They only moved when the chaos started spilling over the sides. But the Brazilian coast had no patience. Everything there changed quickly. Tides, winds, local alliances, French positions, diseases that struck without sending a message. Every new week, something happened that dismantled any European plan. The forest was generous to those who knew it, but cruel to those who arrived dressed in thick wool and boots designed for a Portuguese winter. The sea didn't help either, sometimes calm, sometimes revolted, always unpredictable. And the territory, too vast to fit into any organized idea. Even so, Portugal insisted, sent more people, more orders, more promises. It was like throwing water on a bonfire that no one knew whether they wanted to extinguish or light up. The expedition of 1530 and everything that came after it tried to analyze the entire coast, evaluate routes, establish the first points of presence, and of course maintain the appearance of security. Appearance, of course, because real security would continue to be negotiated with sweat, disease, and sleepless nights for the next few centuries. The sensation there at the beginning of the settlement is simple: institutional improvisation, a nation trying to look like an adult while tripping over its own colonial shoes. A gigantic territory watching everything, silent as if saying, "Good luck, you're going to need it." And a handful of Europeans realizing that nothing, absolutely nothing they learned about climate, cultivation, fauna, or architecture would serve here. It was like trying to assemble a bookshelf following instructions in another language, and without the bookshelf. This is the first great portrait of colonization, an incomplete plan sent with the optimism of someone who hadn't seen the terrain up close. A plan that depended on people, but also depended on luck. And luck, as you know, is a resource that vanishes quickly in the humid heat of the Brazilian coast. And so Brazil began to be populated, sweating, stumbling, hoping, erring, insisting, because if there is something the Portuguese do well, it is to keep trying. Even when the plan clearly hasn't been proofread, the plan of Portugal seemed firm in theory, but practice insisted on showing that the kingdom was doing everything at the pace of someone improvising every breath. And then, as if the immense coast, the heat that stuck to the soul, and the French smiling too much weren't enough, a brilliant solution arises. Divide Brazil into pieces and hand them to reliable people. An idea worthy of someone who never saw a decent map of the continent, probably because one didn't exist. Thus, in 1534, the great administrative experiment is born, the hereditary captaincies. 12 giant strips of land, each with hundreds of kilometers extending into the interior, handed to donataries chosen by the crown. Chosen not for their experience with the tropics, of course, nothing so logical. They were nobles, bureaucrats, people with titles, people with debt, and some who were probably only on the list because they were good conversationalists. It was practically an informal raffle, but with very real consequences. Each strip had imaginary borders drawn on paper that were supposed to manifest in the forest. How to locate these boundaries without adequate instruments? Good question. The most honest answer is, they didn't. They let it be. Whoever arrived first pretended they knew where they were. If anyone asked, they pointed to the woods and said, "That way." It was the colonial version of keep going straight and you'll get there eventually. And naturally, along with the territory came a manual of obligations. The donataries were supposed to colonize, defend, administer justice, incentivize agriculture, develop villages, maintain political relations, and still send part of the profits to the crown. All this without receiving a salary. Yes, you didn't read that wrong. These were nearly impossible missions, with enormous goals, minimal resources, and maximum expectation. The crown handed out lands like someone giving a birthday present, without noticing the present comes without batteries and without instructions. Each donatary received their slice and a letter full of powers, including the right to distribute land grants, create towns, and in theory, command the territory. The problem is that authority on paper doesn't build boats, doesn't fell trees, doesn't negotiate with indigenous groups, and doesn't scare away mosquitoes. And the Brazilian territory seemed to make a point of reminding them of this daily. And there was still an important detail. The crown didn't send enough soldiers. It sent at most a handful of men, some convicts, half a dozen tools, and a timid hope that everything would work itself out. It was a bit like handing an entire farm to someone and saying, "You can do whatever you want, just don't count on us." Some naive optimism was always present in Portuguese decisions. And even if the donataries had goodwill, some even did, none of that overcame the great obstacle. No one knew what they were doing. There was no previous administrative structure. There was no model. There was no logistics to connect captaincies. It was like distributing chapters of a book to different people without explaining what the story was. Each one invented their own. On the coast, small rudimentary nuclei appeared, dispersed, fragile. In the center of the captaincies, nothing but closed forest, wide rivers, and mysterious noises that only reminded the colonists that the territory had its own times and rules. The interior remained unknown, and the border between the donataries' land and no man's land was everything else. The crown imagined that by dividing the lands, it would manage to accelerate the occupation process. It would work if each donatary had resources, experience, and a prepared team. But what they really had was courage, uncertainty, and vague notions of survival. And as if that weren't enough, the captaincies were so distant from one another that communication between them was practically non-existent. The coast might have seemed continuous, but administratively it was a patchwork quilt sewn with loose thread. And of course, the crown made a point of repeating that the donataries had freedom to govern, but this freedom came with an invisible asterisk. Do everything, but don't make mistakes. trying to grow wheat in a tropical climate. Error. Trying to build a village too close to the beach. Error. Trying to stay alive without adequate military support. Inevitable error. Administration was a sort of game that only had a hard mode. And even so, Portugal projected confidence, declaring the captaincies as the definitive solution, a modern, bold, visionary system. In practice, it was a PowerPoint presentation without a tutorial, and even worse, without a projector, without a screen, and without a room. Just vague ideas circulating among people who were beginning to realize they had accepted more responsibility than they could carry. The sensation among colonists and administrators was a mixture of disorientation and fatigue. The process of settlement began to take shape, crooked, unstable, but a shape nonetheless, and the captaincies appeared like poorly assembled skeletons. Some, like San Vicente and Pernambuco, even demonstrated life. Others were born smelling of failure, like someone realizing the entire project is too big to fit into reality. And you, following this narrative, must already feel the weight of improvisation. It is a humid, tropical, and constant weight, the same one the colonists carried. Every attempt to organize territory ran into structural failures, from a lack of instruments to complete ignorance about fauna, flora, and local political dynamics. Brazil, in this beginning, was a great unknown, but Portugal insisted on treating it like a math problem with an easy solution. The Crown sent letters, orders, and expectations. The donataries responded with reports of difficulty, requests for support, and silence. Silence when everything went wrong. Silence when there was no way to repair losses. Silence when part of the colonists fell ill. The return of this information to Lisbon was slow, and Portugal continued making decisions based on approximate maps and methodological optimism, which is to say, without really knowing what was happening here. It is at this point that Brazilian colonization enters a phase that is almost comical. If you have a very dry sense of humor, it was like watching someone trying to tidy up a dark room without lighting a candle, tripping, bumping into things, breaking objects, and in the end, trying to pretend it was all part of the plan. Spoiler, it wasn't part of the plan. The hereditary captaincies were the great Portuguese colonial laboratory, and almost all experiments went wrong before going halfway right. But all of this was part of the slow, tired, and sweaty construction of what Portugal would call Brazil. A territory that existed but still didn't make sense, and a set of administrators who tried, in their own way, to follow rules that didn't dialogue with the ground they walked on. And so, while the Crown imagined prosperity, the donataries dealt with another word: survival. A subtle but decisive difference, because in the humid and mosquito-filled heat of the coast, prospering was an abstract concept. Surviving was not. If the captaincy system already seemed like a castle built with wet sand, the choice of donataries completed the scene. Because, as if it weren't enough to give immense strips of land to nobles who had never stepped foot in a tropical climate, Portugal still assumed that all of them would come running here, full of energy, tools, soldiers, and courage. A beautiful expectation on paper and completely divorced from reality. The fact is that many donataries simply didn't come, nor did they try. They looked at the royal letter, looked at the crude map, looked at the vague descriptions about heat, distance, diseases, and Frenchmen prowling, and decided to stay exactly where they were. Lisbon might be noisy, full of debt and smell of fish, but it was still Lisbon. Brazil, on the other hand, was a confused, humid, and distant promise, very distant. Distant enough to make any noble think twice before getting on a boat. But some came, and those perhaps should have stayed home. Those who arrived quickly discovered that a noble title didn't command the climate, insects, or any territory. The forest didn't recognize noble titles, the heat didn't respect family coats of arms, and the mosquitoes definitely weren't the least bit interested in Portuguese genealogies. The reality was direct, honest, and entirely undiplomatic. The donataries who ventured here had a predictable routine. Disembark full of hope, observe the vastness they needed to administer, realize they had very few resources, and finally face the classic question, what am I doing here? This question used to appear quickly, usually before the first week. It was the colonial version of, I think I've made a huge mistake. And many really did go back. Some due to illness, others due to fear, others because they understood too quickly that governing an entire territory required more than enthusiasm. It required money, a lot of money. And financial return didn't come immediately like that. There was no gold, there was no silver, there were no structured plantations, there was wood, heat, and mosquitoes. And none of those elements supported the Portuguese nobility. The Crown had handed the donataries an administrative package full of powers, but forgot to include the basics. Enough soldiers, artisans in adequate quantity, experienced farmers, doctors, and, of course, any minimal infrastructure. It was like asking someone to build an entire city with half a dozen men, a priest, and a borrowed toolbox. And as if that weren't enough, each captaincy faced different difficulties. Some had more fertile soil, but little security. Others had good inlets, but were attacked by foreigners. Others simply accumulated misfortunes, as if the territory were determined to teach an intensive course in humility to every Portuguese who dared to plant a flag. It was unequal and unpredictable. And the donataries learned this quickly, painfully quickly. An emblematic example is that of captaincies that literally didn't get off the paper. Donataries who didn't even embark already sent word they were reconsidering. The elegant word for this is a trap, and Portugal, with a somewhat resigned patience, tried to redistribute these lands. Only redistributing lands in the 16th century didn't mean guaranteeing occupation. It meant sending another person to try their luck. The sensation was almost comical if you have a sense of humor dry enough. It was like watching a group trying to pitch a tent during a storm, each with different instructions, none with enough tools, and everyone pretending everything was under control. The donataries who stayed discovered another inconvenient truth. The colonists didn't always obey. After all, why obey someone who barely knew where they were, who didn't know the climate, who fainted in the heat, and who made decisions based on what Lisbon thought and not on what the territory demanded? Real authority dissolved in practice. And the donatory needed to negotiate constantly, whether with colonists, with local allies, or with the land itself. And there was still another detail. Many donataries completely underestimated the physical labor necessary. Some imagined that governing meant administering from a veranda while drinking something cool. The reality served a different menu: building palisades, organizing crops, facing diseases, unpredictable weather, and long walks in unknown areas. It was government in sweat and improvisation mode, not in nobility and rest mode. Administrative life had no glamour. It was carrying wet wood, trying to open clearings, dealing with inadequate equipment, and hoping some favorable wind would bring supply ships. And when supplies didn't come, improvisation, lots of improvisation, to the point that even serious decisions were taken based on hunches, because no one had the time or conditions to make deep analyses. It was a colonial management that would fit well in the category not recommended for beginners. The reports that returned to Portugal were a mix of requests for help, creative justifications, and strategic silences. Some donataries tried to seem optimistic so as not to lose support. Others were brutally honest. They wrote to the Crown reporting diseases, difficulties, attacks, abandonment, and lack of resources. And there were those who simply gave up writing. When the silence began to last too long, Lisbon already knew One more captaincy had turned into a headache. And this absence of solid leadership worsened the scenario. Without a present donatory, without minimal structure, without military support, the captaincies became vulnerable. Daily life was dictated by what could be done with hands, with a few tools, and with a lot of improvisation. Local government depended on people who weren't always prepared, but who tried to fulfill some order, even if crooked. All this contributed to the general feeling that colonization was being built with loose pieces of will and absence, a project too big for so few resources. And while the Crown insisted on the discourse of a new land full of possibilities, those who were here knew the correct phrase would be a new land full of difficulties. Absent, lost or regretful donataries left enormous gaps. Gaps that would be filled by colonists trying to survive, by local alliances that were forming, by small villages that rose up crooked, and by decisions made by force. It was the construction of Brazil happening on the limit between the possible and the improvised, with people who wanted very much to get it right, but who made mistakes at the same speed. And so, in the tired continuity of this story, the captaincies began to develop unevenly, crookedly, and almost always in defiance of the Crown's expectations. What was supposed to be a solution became increasingly a reminder that administering immense lands was never simple, especially when the administrators didn't even show up. Colonization followed its slow, hot, humid rhythm, full of mistakes. And the inevitable next step was the emergence of the first villages, crooked, fragile, and full of mud. But that is what comes now. And as if the administrative chaos of the captaincies wasn't enough, the next chapter of this humid epic began, raising villages. Because Portugal needed to prove to itself and the rest of the world that colonization was happening. And nothing says we are standing firm here, like half a dozen mud houses, straw poorly tied to the roof, and a crooked church pointing at the sky creatively. The first Portuguese villages in Brazil were anything but villages. They were points of resistance against abandonment, honest attempts to look like civilization, and monuments to colonial improvisation. São Vicente, the only one that really prospered along with Porto Seguro and the small village of Espírito Santo, emerged as pockets of human insistence, each one fighting against the rain, the wind, the lack of tools, and the tropical wood's natural talent for rotting at the most inconvenient moment. The houses were mostly made of taipa, rammed earth, mashed earth mixed with straw, packed between wooden structures. Does it work? It works. For how long? Depends on the rain, the wind, the bad luck, and how many insects decided to gnaw the base of the wall that week. It was construction in accept it like this mode, and the poor colonists accepted it. There was no alternative. Life was literally between walls made by fingernails, and the mud was everywhere. It appeared on the path, stuck to feet, dried on clothes, entered the interior of houses as if it were a permanent guest. With every rain, and it rained a lot, the floor turned into a shallow lake that swallowed sandals and patience with equal efficiency. There was no pavement. There wasn't enough stone. There was no time to think about sidewalks. The priority was keeping the structures standing, which was already a daily battle. When someone complained too much, that optimistic comment always came, "But at least it's standing." A classic of colonial consolation. The church, of course, always appeared first. Portugal never wasted time when the subject was erecting a visible symbol of presence. But again, don't expect Gothic cathedrals or altars with shine. It was a simple chapel, often crooked, made in a hurry. And whether it was São Vicente, Porto Seguro, or Espírito Santo in the 1530s, this aesthetic torture was guaranteed. The irregular terrain, the humid wood, the constant wind, and the lack of specialized builders created temples that seemed always on the verge of choosing a direction to fall. For the colonists, that was fine. The important thing was having somewhere to pray, asking for mercy from the storms. Inside the houses, life was equally fragile. Little space, little ventilation, and a lot of people trying to share an environment that smelled of green wood, smoke, sweat, and manioc flour. Lighting came from the fire, which insisted on filling the interior with smoke, transforming the ceiling into a kind of permanent cloud. It was useful for scaring away insects, but terrible for health and for the patience of anyone waking up coughing every day. And as if physical discomfort weren't enough, there was still insecurity. The villages were too small to defend themselves solidly. Walls? No way. Some had wooden palisades, fragile and rapidly corroded by the climate. Others, where conflict was constant, even managed to build more robust defenses. Others counted only on the hope that no one was too interested in them. Not the French, not corsairs, nor those living in the surroundings who saw no reason to accept that new presence. The surroundings of the villages were also a constant challenge. The forest came too close, to the point that any walk outside the nucleus seemed like a risky journey. Unknown sounds came from the trees at night, and newly arrived colonists, still accustomed to open landscapes and Portuguese cities, took time to understand that the environment wasn't hostile. They were the strangers there. The nature observed everything, silent, thick, and decisive, and there was still the chronic problem of distance. As everything was isolated, each village needed to fend for itself. If wood was missing, they needed to cut it right then. If food was missing, they needed to fish fast. If someone got sick, treatment was done with whatever was there, and whatever was there was rarely ideal. If a nail was missing, well, a nail was missing. Improvising was a verb conjugated in all tenses. Socialization was equally peculiar. The villages had few inhabitants, all very busy trying to survive. Conversations revolved around work, weather, diseases, and more work. No one had energy for great philosophical debates. Social proximity created community, but also tension. Conflicts arose easily. After all, living piled up in houses that barely protected from the wind tends to leave anyone tense. Meals happened with whatever was available: fresh fish, manioc flour, some occasional game, and when the stars aligned, some livestock. Cooking was a collective effort, and the flavor varied between edible and, okay, this kills hunger. Colonial cuisine, in this beginning, was still trying to understand the territory. The cycle of the village was always the same: build, repair, rebuild. The climate imposed its own rhythm. The heat deformed wood, the rain dissolved mud, the sun dried out what had just dried too much. Nothing stayed the way it was thought. Everything needed constant vigilance. It was life without rest, and even more, life without the prospect of rest. But ironically, this precariousness created the first traces of permanence. Because even crooked, even fragile, even surrounded by mud, the villages were a fixed point in a territory that Europeans were still trying to comprehend. It was there that the first decisions were born, the first judgments, the first agreements. It was there that colonial Brazil began to gain a body, a thin, tired body full of bruises, but a body. And of course, all this happened while the Donataries continued fighting to keep their captaincies standing. Each village was a silent bet that perhaps colonization would work, or at the very least, that it would hold on long enough for help to arrive. Help which, as we already know, didn't come at the desired speed. And so, between crooked houses, improvised chapels, and lots of mud, the first permanent European nuclei in Brazil were born. Living on the border between persistence and giving up, the colonists took a deep breath and continued, because stopping wasn't an option. And if the heat of the villages was already uncomfortable, wait until you see what happens when the tropical climate decides to remind the Europeans that they were in the wrong place with the wrong clothes. If the villages already seemed challenging, the climate made a point of transforming every day into an endurance test. Because, as if it weren't enough to build a house in mud and try to pretend everything was under control, the Europeans still had to deal with the most obvious discovery of all. Brazil was hot, very hot. Hot in a way that didn't appear in any Portuguese report. Perhaps because no one there had the courage to admit they were sending people to live inside an open, humid oven. And the shock began right at disembarkation. The European placed a foot on the sand, and before the dust settled, already felt the air weighing down. A thick air, almost tactile, that stuck to the skin as if it had a will of its own. The clothes began to stick to the body before completing 5 steps. It wasn't exaggeration, it was tropical physics, and tropical physics doesn't care about wool fabrics, stiff linen, and layers that seem to have been sewn to face the North Atlantic winter, not the Brazilian sun. The heat made the Portuguese sweat in a way they didn't even know the human body was capable of. It was sweat on the back, sweat behind the knee, sweat in places that never received attention in Europe. And the clothes simply absorbed everything, absorbed and returned it in the form of a smell, a colonial perfume that mixed salt, fabric aged by the voyage, and a touch of despair. Spoiler, no one got used to it. They just gave up complaining after a few months. Maybe because the hot air carried the voice away before it reached someone's ears. And the humidity was an entity apart, invisible, persistent, insistent. Nothing dried. Nothing. Clothes remained slightly damp even when dry. The walls of the house sweated. The mattress kept liquid memories of the previous night. Wood swelled and warped and made cracks that sounded like footsteps in the dark, while mold attacked clothes, supplies, and everything that had fiber at the same rhythm that the typer threatened to dissolve with the rain. And there was still the sun, a sun that didn't illuminate. It attacked. It came from above, reflected on the sand, reflected on the water, entered through the leaves, and found the colonist wherever he tried to hide. It was a persistent, disciplined sun, almost polite in its daily cruelty. The skin of the Portuguese, used to weak light and cold breeze, couldn't take it. Redness, burning, blisters. The ideal coloring of a newly arrived European was a gradient that went from burnt pink to almost hot red. And yes, they tried to splash water on their face to relieve it, only to discover the water was warm too. But the heat didn't act alone. It had partners in crime. The first of them was mold. Colonial mold was a prolific artist. It fed on everything: clothes, walls, wood, chests, supplies. It grew fast, silent, as if it had been invited to participate in the construction of the village. The colonists fought against it every day, and every day they lost. The mold had the advantage: time, humidity, and local experience. The colonists had only tired tools and a lot of desire to give up. And as if internal humidity weren't enough, there was torrential rain, thick, dramatic. When the sky decided to fall, it really fell, without warning, without ceremony, without pause. The mud houses trembled, the walls softened, puddles multiplied, the village turned into a great corridor of running mud. The noise was so loud that not even the priest could compete during Mass. Perhaps that is why prayers were so intense in this period. Nothing like a roof threatening to fall to bring people closer to faith. The wind also entered the game. Not a fresh, relieving wind. It was a hot, charged wind that seemed to blow only to mess up the straw on the roof and scatter mosquitoes. It came from the forest, bringing the smell of leaves, humidity, and every now and then something undefined that made everyone look at the ground with a bit of caution. It was the wind warning that nothing there followed European rules. And we need to talk about the clothes. The clothes. Those heavy, thick-lined fabrics with layers that made sense in Portuguese winters and 0 sense on the Brazilian coast. The stiff linen scratched the skin, the wool accumulated heat. Shoes made for European floors sank in the mud like stones. And the hats, well, the hats were the only ones that really helped, but only a little. just enough not to faint in the middle of the afternoon, although some fainted anyway. The redundancy of these clothes was so great that many colonists slowly began to reduce layers. First they took off the doublet, then the lining, then prayed that no one important would complain about the simplicity of the attire. But resisting was useless. The heat always won. It was the one dictating fashion. Tropical fashion, let it be said. The aesthetic of, I'll wear only what doesn't kill me. And even so, sometimes it seemed that everything was trying to kill. In the middle of this climatic struggle, the colonists realized there was no interval. The day was hot, the night was hot, the dawn was humid, and the morning arrived with a warm breath that embraced everyone without permission. Sleeping was a challenge. The room got stuffy, the walls exhaled accumulated heat, and the mattress straw heated up like resigned embers. Colonial insomnia didn't come from worry. It came from the climate. The worry arrived later. And as if all that weren't enough, there were the insects, because heat and humidity are an open invitation to any creature with wings, a stinger, or minimal interest in disturbing humans. The mosquitoes were constant, insistent, and numerous enough to transform any night into passive war. The bites itched, inflamed, and left marks, and no one knew what caused the fevers, which only made everything more interesting. The climatic shock in the end wasn't just annoying, it was pedagogical. It taught daily that Brazil wasn't going to bend for the Portuguese. It was the Portuguese who would need to adapt. And adapting here meant sweating in silence, adjusting expectations, praying more than planned, and accepting that the kingdom perhaps had sent too many people with winter clothes to a land that honestly didn't even know what winter was. And so, with a hot body, heavy clothes, and humor increasingly diluted by sweat, the colonists went on living, trying to work, trying not to get sick, trying not to go crazy. But the heat was just starting to have fun. If the heat had already taken the colonists' dignity, it was natural that the food would come to take the rest. Because, as if wearing wool in a humid climate and trying to sleep in houses that creaked like tired boats weren't enough, the Europeans now discovered that eating in Brazil was a spiritual experience. And not in the good sense. It was one more daily lesson in culinary humility. Abundance wasn't lacking. The people who knew how to use it were the indigenous people. As for the European, he was still trying to discover what was edible and what was the forest's revenge. The first discovery came fast. Planting wheat didn't work. It really didn't work. The tropical soil, the humidity, the pests, the climate, everything conspired against European flour. The colonist arrived excited, threw seeds, prayed, and harvested absolutely nothing. Some attempts yielded weak, sad sprouts that died in the first month of heat. Others didn't even have sprouts. It was the wheat saying, "Go back home, this isn't for you." And as if this frustration weren't enough, another came. Grapes. Because yes, they tried to plant vines and failed beautifully. The vines got sick, rotted, or simply gave up existing. It was almost symbolic. The wine didn't want to live there, which for a 16th century Portuguese person was practically a personal offense. The colony was starting to prove it wouldn't make anything easy. Faced with European agricultural failure, the inevitable solution emerged. Learn from those who had already lived there for centuries. Manioc, for example. The indigenous people mastered its cultivation, knew how to prepare it, knew how to extract the flour, knew that certain varieties were poisonous and needed to be treated. The colonists didn't know anything. Manioc seemed simple, but it had rules. Rules that the European insisted on ignoring. Some colonists tried to eat the root raw. Result, problems. Others tried to cook it too fast, result more problems. Manioc was generous but didn't forgive laziness. It was necessary to grate, squeeze, toast the flour, Prepare with patience. And patience wasn't exactly an abundant virtue among colonists who were already on the verge of collapse because of the climate. Even so, little by little, it became the basis of the diet. Dry flour, coarse flour, fine flour, mixed with fish, with water, with a little honey, with hope. Manioc saved lives, but it also reminded the Portuguese every day that the colony wouldn't obey the European palate. And of course, there were fruits, many fruits. Fruits the Europeans had never seen, some sweet, others sour, others too mysterious to risk. But the colonist needed to risk. Hunger gives no room for philosophical hesitation. The first bite of certain fruits was a combination of surprise and doubt. The taste was different, strong, impossible to compare with anything from Europe. Some loved it, others simply accepted it. Others were suspicious for weeks, as if the cashew was plotting something. Fishing saved difficult days. The Brazilian coast offered big fish, small, strange, tasty fish. But again, there was the problem of climate. Fish spoiled fast, really fast. One oversight and lunch turned into a threat. The smell denounced the changes, and the colonists learned quickly that the warm breeze helped absolutely nothing. Thus is born the recurring habit of salting everything, drying everything, exaggerating the fire. It was the only way to guarantee the food wouldn't take revenge on him. Hunting was also part of the routine, but with much caution. The forest wasn't a Portuguese backyard, it was a living and unpredictable universe, full of sounds, smells, and creatures the Europeans couldn't identify. Some animals were safe, others not so much. Some seemed edible, others seemed like a formal complaint from nature against the Portuguese presence. That is why hunting was always trial and error, with an emphasis on error. And there was still the eternal dispute with insects, because everything, absolutely everything, attracted insects. The flour, the fish, the meat, the fruit, the sweat, the clothes, the air. If foods weren't prepared quickly, they turned into an ant condominium in 3 hours. Flies prowled any piece of meat. And mosquitoes? Well, mosquitoes were just using the human kitchen as a meeting point. Even so, the colonists tried to be creative. They mixed flour with hot water and called it papa, mush. They put dry fish on top and with a little courage called it a meal. Sometimes they added some spice brought from Europe when available, and this created a brief moment of happiness. But as always, brief. And when food ran out, improvisation became the rule. Stews made with leftovers, pots of flour divided among various families, frantic searches for edible fruits. The colony was always 2 steps away from complete supply failure. And even so, life went on. Improvised parties also had improvised food. Small banquets that seemed large due to the effort, not the size. Roasted fish, toasted flour, perhaps some fermented drink made in a hurry. Nothing compared to Portuguese tables, but enough to remind them that despite everything, there was still humanity among so much mud, sweat, and uncertainty. And of course, there were the dishes no one wanted, but everyone ate. Thin soups, unbalanced broths, pieces of dubious meat. It was the type of meal that brings no joy, but keeps you alive. The colonists swallowed and moved on. There was no room for fussiness. Survival doesn't combine with pickiness. And the most ironic thing, even with all this effort, hunger prowled. Not extreme famine, but constant hunger. The feeling that something was always missing, that you could never eat enough, that the body was always a little weaker than it should be. It was the accumulated effect of adaptation, lack of structure, distance from everything known. Deep down, eating in Brazil between 1530 and 1549 was accepting that the colony had its own rhythms. It was learning to respect manioc, fear fish that smelled strange, observe fruit before biting, and pray that the salt wouldn't run out. It was a ritual of discovery and resignation, and the colonists, even tired, continued. After all, the next challenge would arrive at dawn. Infernal nights, hungry mosquitoes, and mysterious fevers. And yes, you are going to feel this too, as if the heat Improvised food and infinite mud weren't enough to convince any European to reconsider their life choices. The moment arrived when tropical Brazil opened its true rule book at night, because by day it was hard, but by night it was pedagogical. Nature taught line by line that rest was not included in the colonial package. The first student of this class was the mosquito, not a shy, discreet, almost symbolic mosquito. None of that. It was swarms, clouds, entire sets of winged creatures that seemed to have been notified of the Portuguese arrival in advance. And they didn't come to observe, they came to work. The sound started soft, a vibration near the ear, and little by little turned into a tuned, insistent choir, impossible to ignore. The colonists tried to swat one away and 3 came in its place. It was tropical mathematics. The bite burned at the beginning, then itched, then inflamed. And when the colonists thought that was all, the fever came. Not every day, of course. Nature liked to maintain suspense. Sooner or later, someone shivered, sweated cold, lost their appetite, and spent hours in silence, staring at the straw ceiling as if it held answers to life. It didn't hold them. It just held more insects. And as if the terrestrial mosquito wasn't enough, there were other, smaller and equally infernal enemies: gnats, sandflies, midges. The names varied by region, but the annoyance was universal. Too small to avoid, too numerous to ignore. They entered through cracks in walls, landed on faces, attacked ankles, hid in the folds of clothes. The colonist spent a good part of the night mentally negotiating with these creatures. Just today, please. Just today, leave me in peace. Negotiation always refused, but the kingdom of insects wasn't the only one responsible for the nocturnal chaos. The temperature helped. The air, even after sunset, remained hot. A stuffy, heavy heat that made the body stick to the straw mattress and made breathing a conscious exercise. The house, without adequate ventilation, turned into a kind of colonial greenhouse. The colonist started the dawn sweating and finished sweating even more, and there was still the noise, because the forest at night never slept. Each village was surrounded by a symphony of sounds Europeans couldn't decipher. Strident crickets, nocturnal birds, snaps in the leaves, abrupt movements in the woods, nothing like big roars, but sounds sufficient to make any newcomer rethink their life choices. For those who didn't understand any of that, it sounded like a warning. There was life there, lots of life, and not all life was friendly, not that it made a difference. The colonists couldn't sleep anyway. Insecurity also guaranteed its share of insomnia. Even with improvised palisades, the sensation of vulnerability was permanent. The sea could bring invaders, the land could bring conflicts, the woods could bring unknown creatures. It was a world where every shadow deserved an extra look. Every noise was interpreted as a sign that something was approaching. Maybe it was wind, maybe it was an animal, maybe it was just the wood creaking. But in the tired mind, everything was a threat. This is without speaking of diseases, because fever didn't come only from mosquitoes. Water that didn't boil properly could bring problems. River water was clean enough. The problem began when the Europeans stored it in hot barrels, shallow wells, or left it standing too long. Poorly cooked food could bring even more. Constant humidity weakened the body, and lack of rest finished the job. The colonists got sick easily and recovered slowly. Fever rose, fell, rose again, as if it were doing a complete tour of the European body. The body suffered and the house collaborated in the suffering. The straw of the mattress accumulated heat and humidity, creating an aroma difficult to describe, something between hot wood, sweat, and resignation. The feather pillow, which seemed a good idea in Europe, turned into a compact block, limp and slightly sticky. Smoke from the fire, which rose to the ceiling during the day, descended at night and mixed with the air, creating a light sensation of continuous suffocation. It was the type of environment any modern manual would call inadequate for sleeping, but there was no manual. There was only reality. And with every sleepless night, the colonists began to understand that colonial Brazil was a kind of practical class in patience, a tropical patience that involved itching, heat, and an enormous capacity to pretend all that was normal. They tried to dodge insects with smoke, with leaves, with fire lit in a clay pot, but nothing worked for long. The mosquitoes were persistent, resilient, trained by the environment. The colonist was the rookie, and you, following the narrative, must have already felt the weight of this night. It is always like this. The day wears you out, the night destroys you. There is no victory, there is only survival. Survival. And well, speaking of that, if you arrived this far, you are either stuck in this story out of dubious curiosity, or you are already in the sleepwalking mode of sleep, trying to pretend you didn't hear the imaginary mosquito passing your ear. Either way, since you are here lost in the middle of this tropical chaos, take the chance to like this video and subscribe to the channel. I know it's tiring, but it helps. It helps much more than any colonist helped a donatory in that period, to be honest. Now, let's continue, because the unfriendly nights were only half the experience. The other half came from interaction, complex, intense, and not always understood, with native peoples. And this, as you will see, would be one of the deepest layers of colonial life. If the Knights had already convinced Europeans that Brazil wasn't interested in softening anyone's life, coexistence with native peoples completed the portrait of the beginning of colonization. Complex, profound, full of nuances no Portuguese person was prepared to understand. Because, as if it wasn't enough to deal with heat, mosquitoes, and improvised food, the colonists now needed to deal with something even more frightening for someone arriving from a different world. Another way of living. And of course, Portugal hadn't sent a manual. No instructions like how to converse and how to negotiate, how not to cause a problem. The European arrived with certainties, all wrong. He thought he could impose rhythm, impose logic, impose structure. And he quickly discovered that none of that worked. The territory didn't obey, the plants didn't obey, logistics didn't obey, and the native peoples much less so. The truth is that for those who had lived here for centuries, the Portuguese were just another group. Foreigners like so many others who had appeared on the coast, some nicer, others more intrusive. And among these foreign groups, the French used to be more pleasant. They traded, talked, offered products, had more interest in creating balanced alliances. The Portuguese arrived with an air of permanence, and permanence always complicates everything. But coexistence wasn't simple for either side. The Europeans didn't understand the local social organization, didn't understand the logic of territory, leadership, or circulation. They didn't comprehend the rituals, the language, the gestures, the own economy that existed long before any ship crossed the Atlantic. For them, each village was a mystery, a living mystery, complex and full of invisible rules, and yet they depended deeply on these relationships. Without alliances with native peoples, no captaincy would survive. Without knowledge of paths, hunting, fishing, medicinal plants, the colonists wouldn't last through the first rainy season. It was a real, constant dependence that many Portuguese pretended not to notice, but everyone felt on their skin, sometimes literally. And of course there were interpreters, not always professionals. Most of the time they were degradados, people forcibly sent to Brazil, who ended up living among different indigenous groups, learning languages and customs. Later they were used as improvised cultural bridges, a bridge that sometimes helped and sometimes just made everything worse. Because translating life is not the same thing as translating words. It was like trying to translate a forest using only the sound of the wind. But despite difficulties, alliances arose, some based on mutual need, others on political interest. The Brazilian coast had different peoples with different strategies and different relationships among themselves. The European newcomer was seen as a possible ally in ancient conflicts, and the Portuguese, in administrative desperation, accepted. They accepted without completely understanding what it meant, which always brought consequences. Alliance meant exchange. Exchange of objects, knowledge, military support, joint presence. For many indigenous peoples, this made sense within their own logic of relationship. For the Portuguese, it made sense within the urgent logic of survival. It was a meeting between two coherences, neither superior to the other, but completely incompatible when misinterpreted. And of course, misunderstandings happened all the time. A gesture that seemed like friendship to one side could look like invasion to the other. A simple request could turn into an offense. An inadvertent exchange of objects could be seen as a pact, and silence could be interpreted as rupture. There was no cultural translation book. There was only attempt. Attempt, error, attempt again, and error again, now with more intensity. And there were also conflicts because coexistence doesn't mean automatic harmony. It was a time of political tension between different native peoples, and the Portuguese arrival only added one more variable. The European presence wasn't always welcome and wasn't always tolerated. The colonist, convinced that it was enough to ask, would ask, and the proud territory would respond in varied ways. When attacks on villages arose, they were rarely random attacks. They were responses to territorial invasions, to behaviors seen as offensive, to Portuguese decisions made in haste. The colony learned fast that living here required careful reading of the political environment, a reading that the Crown, far away, had no idea how to interpret. And even so, the relationship wasn't made only of conflict. It was made also of daily coexistence, food exchanges, technique exchanges, mutual help, joint walks on trails the colonists would never find alone. Small gestures revealed that, despite the cultural distance, everyone was trying to survive. In their own way, yes, but trying. The biggest shock always came from time. Indigenous time was circular, ample, connected to the environment. Portuguese time was linear, anxious, hurried. While the European wanted fast results, plant today, harvest tomorrow, build this week, the territory followed its ancestral rhythm, and the peoples here did too. The European thought there was urgency. The territory thought there was an excess of expectation, and that is where frustration arose. The Portuguese wanted immediate answers. The indigenous person observed the weather and said, "No, wait." The colonist wished the village would grow fast. The territory responded with torrential rain. The donatary wanted to organize everything, and discovered that to organize, he first needed to learn. Learn from those who already knew, learn by watching, learn by listening, learn by getting frustrated. But, despite everything, alliances were fundamental to keep the first decades of colonization functioning. Without them, no boat saved them, no captaincy lasted. Portuguese survival, as much as some denied it, was deeply intertwined with indigenous knowledge and support. And this silent truth sustained the colony before any official structure was created. And so life went on, between agreements, misunderstandings, care, caution, and a learning process that always happened too late. It was coexistence in layers, sometimes light, sometimes tense, always essential, and in the dragging rhythm of the villages, it molded the territory. Now, while this coexistence was drawing itself, there was another problem growing slowly, the complete disconnection between the captaincies. But that is the next layer of discomfort. And although coexistence with native peoples already made it clear that nothing in colonial Brazil would come with a manual, there was another problem growing in silence and growing fast: the total lack of communication between the captaincies. It was as if Portugal had created several independent countries and decided they should all succeed alone, trusting only in the strength of goodwill. Spoiler: goodwill doesn't hold up a fence post. Each captaincy became its own organism, with its rhythms, its difficulties, and of course, its crises. There were no roads, there was no fast route. The coast was long, irregular, windy, and navigating between one point and another depended on tide, wind, and luck. And luck, as we have already seen, wasn't a very abundant commodity in the colony. Result, each region learned to manage in its own way without knowing what the neighbor was doing. It was administration in every man for himself and God for everyone mode. San Vicente, for example, developed some structure. Pernambuco grew thanks to sugar experience. Other captaincies seem to exist only to remind Portugal that not every noble is a good administrator. And the colonists of these more chaotic regions knew they couldn't count on help. Distance made everything impossible. Sending a message from one captaincy to another was almost as difficult as sending a letter to the moon, with the difference that the moon didn't have mud. And this disconnection created curious situations. While one captaincy tried to survive famine, another was dealing with excess flour production. While one dealt with French attacks, another lived calmly because no one even remembered it existed. It was a generalized mismatch. Each donatory dealt with their own universe, like small improvised kings, governing kingdoms they never asked to exist. And of course, this lack of communication affected even security. If a village was attacked, the others wouldn't even know, and even if they knew, it would take weeks, sometimes months, to manage to send some type of help. The colony was so dispersed that the news aged before arriving. An attack in January turned into a legend in April, and legend, as always, solved nothing. In the middle of this, there was still the problem of Portuguese expectations. Lisbon imagined the captaincies would work like gears of the same machine, an optimistic view, organized and completely disconnected from tropical reality. The Crown imagined synchronized reports, uniform growth, cohesive administration. In practice, what arrived were letters saying, "We are trying, we have no resources, things are difficult," and a suspicious silence coming from captaincies that had practically already failed. And as if this administrative chaos weren't enough, there was geography. The Brazilian coast didn't help. Shallow bays, areas with reefs, stretches without a safe point to anchor. Navigating between captaincies required skill, patience, and a dose of courage many sailors didn't have. And of course, there was the unpredictable climate, always ready to transform a short trip into an episode of maritime survival. Isolation made each captaincy develop its own solution, even for universal problems. Food was missing, each one improvised their way. Tools missing, try to fabricate with what you have. Labor missing, reorganize tasks. Wood missing, cut more forest, even knowing this could cause conflict with local peoples. It was improvisation piled on improvisation, without any guarantee that decisions wouldn't make everything worse. And the dry humor of the situation came precisely from the fact that no donatory knew if they were doing well. There was no comparative, there was no official number, there was no colonial standard. Each one thought they were failing alone, without knowing the other captaincies were equally lost. It was a silent collective failure, democratic even to a fault. Some donataries went so far as to send letters to Lisbon with an almost defensive tone. "We are doing the possible," which translated into modern English meant, "We have no idea what we are doing, but we are trying not to die." And the saddest part is that in this context, that was practically administrative excellence. And there was still the question of internal conflicts. Without communication between captaincies, each one made different political decisions. Some prioritized alliances with certain native peoples, others created stricter rules. Others simply pretended they had control over the territory, a pretense that fooled no one, not even the Mosquitoes. The villages reflected this disorganization. One village might have a wooden palisade, another no protection. One had aligned houses, another was just a random grouping of crooked constructions. There was no model, there was no pattern. Colonial Brazil was a mosaic that Portugal pretended was a coherent picture, and this isolation made every problem bigger. The lack of doctors, for example. In a captaincy with few qualified people, any disease spread fast, and there was nowhere to run. The next village was too far away. Help arrived too late. It was life based on resistance and improvisation. Always him. The most curious thing is that for the colonists, this isolation became part of the routine. No one expected help. No one expected instruction. The colony created its own mentality. If it works, it works. If it goes wrong, we keep trying. It was all so slow, so disconnected, so artisanal, that even failure seemed normalized. And meanwhile, the Crown continued insisting that the captaincies were a great project, a modern, efficient, well-thought-out project. Only the ocean between Lisbon and Brazil was too big for anyone there to understand the level of chaos here. And the donataries had no way to explain it properly. Even when they tried, letters took months to arrive. By then, the problem had already changed and changed again. It was like trying to govern a country by mail. And mail that gets lost, delays, gets wet, tears, or simply doesn't arrive. But Portugal insisted, sent new orders, new desires, new expectations, and each captaincy read all this like someone receiving an impossible task list. Do and stay alive competed daily. Deep down, each captaincy became what it managed to be. Geography defined a part, local alliances defined another. Luck defined the rest. Some prospered, others dragged themselves, others sank without ceremony. It was the first great lesson of colonization. Portugal could divide the territory in straight lines on paper, but the territory returned everything in curves. And so followed the beginning of Brazil, fragmented, disconnected, full of regions that barely knew of each other's existence. A country that wasn't yet a country, formed by pieces that barely spoke. And this made the routine even heavier, because working without knowing if the neighbor is alive is always a little uncomfortable. And since we are talking about routine, it is time to enter it. The colonial daily life, tired, hot, repetitive, stubborn, was just waiting to be described. The most curious thing about life in the captaincies wasn't the administrative chaos, nor the mosquitoes, nor the constant feeling that the entire colony could collapse with heavier rain. It was the daily life, the routine, that sequence of tasks that repeated day after day, always equal, always tired, always hot. It was like living inside an infinite repetition, with heat as the supervisor and mud as the co-worker. And yes, there was humor in this. Dry humor, of course, because no one there had the energy to laugh out loud. The day began before the sun, not by choice, but because the temperature rose too fast. If you waited for the sun to heat up, working became torture. So the colonists woke up with the sky still dark blue, rubbed their faces, took a deep breath, and began the routine. A routine that ironically started tired because sleeping well didn't exist. There was only resting enough not to fall on the ground. The first tasks included lighting the fire, scaring away any nocturnal insect that had decided to live in the corner of the house, removing accumulated rainwater, and checking if the roof straw was still in place. The straw had a natural talent for flying away just on the day no one had time to put it back. Nature had its own humor, and unfortunately a very cruel humor. Then came the physical part. Carrying wood, cutting trunks, opening clearings, repairing fences, taking care of the crops, all by hand, all heavy, all done under a sun that insisted on reminding everyone that Brazil is close to the equator. The colonists sweated in the very first minute. That sweat that stuck, stung the eyes, and transformed any shirt into a soaked cloth. And even so, no one stopped. Not by will, but by necessity. Survival is a powerful motivator. And there was still the problem of tools. European tools weren't made for the tropical climate. Humidity rusted everything. Tropical wood was hard as stone, and intense use finished the job. The colonist struck an axe on the trunk, and suddenly the handle came loose. Struck a hoe on the ground and the blade bent. It was as if objects made a point of participating in the general conspiracy against progress. The construction of villages was equally repetitive. Raising walls, repairing walls, rebuilding walls. The cycle never ended. Rain removed the mud, wind misaligned the straw, sun cracked the wood. The colonist took a deep breath, looked at the crooked house, and said with improvised philosophy, "At least it's still standing." It was the colonial mantra, a phrase that replaced any more optimistic expectation. And even though everything was difficult, there was always some task waiting. Carrying water, for example. Wells didn't always exist, and when they did, they weren't always reliable. The most common solution was walking to nearby creeks. Short walks, but long enough for the sun to bother and mosquitoes to line up. The water was heavy, the path was slippery, and of course, there was always a good chance of tripping in the mud and spilling everything. The economy of swear words in that period was impossible. The routine of the fields was another spectacle of persistence. Planting manioc, corn, some possible vegetable, caring for plants, trying to avoid pests, and accepting that part of the harvest would always be lost, whether to the climate, to animals, or to simple bad luck. And the colonist, experienced or not, learned early that complaining solved nothing. The most he got was more heat, and when he wasn't working in the field, he was carrying wood. And when he wasn't carrying wood, he was helping in construction. And when he wasn't building, he was trying to fix something that had broken, because everything broke. Colonial Brazil was a factory of small daily problems, as if the territory took pleasure in testing European patience. Amidst these tasks, there was social interaction, short, practical conversations, always about work, weather, food, or disease. No one had energy to philosophize. Life was measured in hours of sweat, not hours of reflection. And even in the few and short pauses, the colonists remained attentive to the sounds of the forest. It was rest with vigilance, and vigilance with fear. Meals were fast, almost functional. Flour, fish, some broth, something roasted on the fire. Sometimes everything went right. Sometimes everything went wrong. Sometimes someone forgot the fish too close to the heat and it turned to charcoal. Sometimes the flour ran out early and it was necessary to improvise with tiny portions. Eating was part of daily life, but it was never simple. And as if physical effort wasn't enough, there was mental effort. Every decision required calculation. Every action had risk. Building in the wrong area could attract trouble. Planting in the wrong soil meant losing weeks of work. Making a path through the woods could be safe or could be exactly the opposite. Nothing had a guarantee. Nothing had a manual. It was an entire daily life based on the dangerous combination between necessity and attempt. The body tired, the mind tired, even the shadow tired. And even so, everyone continued, because stopping wasn't an option. There was no big city nearby, there was no always active port, there was no constant support. The village was the world, the village was the center. Everything that existed was there, crooked, hot, and full of defects, but existing. And humor, even dry, ended up appearing among the colonists. Jokes about tools breaking, about the heat, about the straw flying away, about the manioc that is never ready at the ideal time. It was survival humor, that type of irony that serves as a mechanism not to go crazy, and it worked at least a little. But as always, there were worse days. Days when the rain fell too hard and everything turned to mud. Days when no one slept because of fever. Days when the harvest failed. Days when some animal took part of the production. Days when the roof gave way. And of course days when all this happened at the same time. The complete colonial combo. Colonial daily life was this: constant effort, minimal return, and a tiredness that didn't disappear. A tiredness that accumulated like dust in the corners of the house. And the colonists, knowing they had no choice, just went on, breathed deep, sweated a little more, adjusted the tool, and restarted the task. And this routine, this heavy and slow rhythm, began to show Portugal that nothing was working as planned, because a colony doesn't survive only on sweat. It needs structure, command, coordination, and that no captaincy was managing to deliver. And that is where the whole system starts to show cracks, large, visible cracks full of consequences. And although daily life had already left any European on the verge of spiritual resignation, it was in administration that chaos really shone. Because the captaincies weren't just isolated, hot and difficult. They were also walking administrative failures. And if before this seemed just an annoyance, now it began to become evident that the entire system was, how to put it, warped, crooked, misaligned, spoiler, irreparable in that way. The letters from donataries arriving in Lisbon began to form a chorus that was not encouraging. Some described attacks, others spoke of hunger, others cited abandonment, and others, perhaps the most honest, just said, "Things are hard," which in colonial language means we have no idea how to stay alive. But Portugal read all this with the calm of someone too far away to understand the size of the headache. And as if the accumulation of problems wasn't enough, there was also the problem of accumulated silence, because various captaincies simply didn't write, didn't send news, didn't produce anything, didn't give signs of life. When a letter didn't arrive for months, Lisbon imagined storms, shipwrecks, problems on the way, but the most common explanation was sadder. No one inside had the time, health, or structure to write. There were captaincies where the donatory didn't even show up anymore. There were captaincies where the donatory came, looked, sweated, got discouraged and returned home before even learning the name of the village. There were captaincies where officially everything was under control, but in practice there were only 3 houses, a tired priest and a group of colonists arguing about which part of the crops hadn't been destroyed by rain yet. And this disconnection between Portugal and tropical reality began to generate disastrous decisions. Lisbon sent optimistic orders like expand agricultural production when there was barely production to survive. It also asked for greater exploration of the interior, as if the interior were a backyard and not an infinite forest that swallowed trails in 3 weeks. It was communication full of desire and completely empty of logic. And there was still the great enemy Portugal didn't want to admit, the French. They appeared smiling, exchanging gifts, trading, signing alliances. They were a constant presence, unofficial, but constant. Some donataries tried to fight them, others pretended not to see, others lamented not having the same support the French offered in exchanges. It was tropical diplomacy in improvised mode, and improvisation with foreigners rarely ends well. The truth is that each captaincy was fighting its own daily battle against the climate, against diseases, against hunger, against administrative loneliness, and against its own structural incapacity. And when these internal wars began to get too heavy, the cry for help came, a sincere, repeated, almost desperate request. Send people, send resources, send guidance. And Portugal responded in the most efficient way possible for someone too far away. Late. When reinforcement arrived months later, the captaincy had already changed problems, and again, and sometimes changed donatories too. But the most interesting collapse, and perhaps most emblematic, was the financial collapse. The donataries spent much more than they had. They invested, built, ordered tools, ordered works, tried to expand villages, and discovered quickly that colonial math didn't add up. The terrain consumed more than it produced. Rain destroyed more than the crops gave. Wood rotted before turning into profit. It was a bad business, packaged as an opportunity. And of course, there was the old Portuguese feeling that, with a little more effort, it will go. It didn't go with effort, nor sweat, nor prayer. Some captaincies simply sank like ships in a bad tide. Local administration disappeared, the settlement emptied, The French occupied a piece, the indigenous people retook another, and the donatary, in diplomatic silence, pretended not to see. The most ironic thing was that while all this happened, Portugal still tried to maintain the appearance of normality. It proclaimed that the system was working, that the captaincies were modern, daring, visionary instruments, that everything was moving according to plan. An optimistic discourse that matched perfectly with the distance of an entire ocean. But those on the ground, literally on the ground, often with feet stuck in mud trying to save wet wood, knew the system wasn't dysfunctional. It was bankrupt. There was no solid leadership. There was no reliable communication. There was no collaboration between regions. It was each captaincy living its personal soap opera, a long, confusing soap opera, full of characters who disappeared in the second episode and with a plot that never advanced. When a captaincy needed support, the neighbour had no way to help. When Lisbon needed answers, donataries had no way to send them. When a decision needed to be made, no one knew if the information was current. It was governing with shadows, shadows that changed shape, size and direction. And then, little by little, Portugal began to admit the obvious. The hereditary captaincy system wasn't working, not as a settlement model, not as an administrative model, and much less as an economic model. It was a bold experiment, too bold, an experiment that generated valuable lessons, all learned by force. Even so, the Crown took its time. It took longer than it should have. Because admitting failure is never easy, especially when you're a kingdom trying to administer a territory that looks 3 times bigger than your imagination predicted. But the failures were there, visible, growing, and, as if not enough, dangerous. The risk of losing territory to foreigners was real, the risk of internal collapse too. And when even institutional optimism begins to get uncomfortable, it is because something really needs to change. It was then that the inevitable perception arose. It was time to create a central command, someone to unite the captaincies, organize the mess, establish real structure, impose some order on the chaos. An administrative chief capable of dealing with everything at the same time, without guarantee of success, of course, but with the hope that perhaps, just perhaps, the colony could survive. And so, after almost 2 decades of improvisation, sweat and frustration, Portugal decides to do something it should have done from the beginning: send a general government. And this is where a name enters that you will still hear several times in this tired night: Tomé de Sousa. And although Portugal had spent almost 20 years pretending the captaincies were working as expected, a moment arrives when even the most stubborn kingdom needs to look at its own creation and admit it is limping, coughing, and asking for help in 3 languages. It was thus that in 1549 a sensible decision emerged: send someone to put order in that set of tropical problems. And that someone was Tomé de Sousa, a man who very likely only discovered the hard part of the mission when he was already halfway there. Spoiler, perhaps it was better that way. Tomé de Sousa disembarks with a clear mission: organize Brazil, which in practice meant solving structural failures, uniting captaincies, creating a city, mounting defense, dealing with the French, administering conflicts, establishing justice, strengthening the economy, and surviving the Mosquitoes. A position of the kind that makes anyone rethink their career choice. But Tomé had what many donataries lacked: military experience, discipline, and above all, a sense of reality. He didn't come to improvise, he came to function. And to function, he needed a base, literally. So the first great task was choosing where to install the capital of the general government. The location needed to have a good bay, strategic position, relatively easy access, and if possible, a moderate amount of mosquitoes. The latter didn't exist, of course, but it doesn't hurt to try. Thus arises Salvador, not as a tourist destination, but as an advanced outpost of urgent organization. A city born with a very simple objective: prevent the chaos from getting even bigger. The foundation of Salvador wasn't glamorous. No grand ceremonies. It was sweat, mud, wood being carried by people too tired to complain. Building a city in the 16th century meant gathering workers, aligning lots, assembling houses, raising a church, defining public spaces, and praying that a storm wouldn't wash everything away before the first mass. The initial landscape was composed of excavated banks, warped wood, and a generous volume of hope, but curiously well-administered hope. And Tomé knew how to delegate, something rare in the colonial period. He brought officers, masters of trade, soldiers, trained men. He also brings what Portugal considered essential to civilize the colony: justice, judges, notaries, scribes, people who knew how to register, organize, prohibit. The idea was simple: where there is paper, there is order. And of course, where there is paper, there is also the certainty that someone will lose that paper in the first heavy rain. But nothing defines 1549 more than the arrival of the group that would profoundly change cultural and educational relations: the Jesuits. Led by Father Manuel da Nóbrega, they disembark with a clear mission: evangelize, teach, mediate conflicts, and principally act as a bridge between different worlds. It was the first great institutional religious presence in Brazil. Before them, everything was an isolated attempt. Now, structure began to emerge. The Jesuits were disciplined, studious, meticulous, and, let's agree, extremely stubborn. They learned indigenous languages, lived with different peoples, accompanied villages, participated in rituals, taught reading, discussed doctrine, and above all, tried to balance Portuguese pressures with local realities. A job that required almost infinite patience, patience which, to everyone's surprise, they had. And while the Jesuits initiated their missions, Tomé de Souza mounted defenses. He knew that without fortifications, Salvador would be nothing more than a pretty village waiting for the first foreign ship to become a problem. So came reinforced palisades, guard structures, observation points. Nothing very impressive, but sufficient to keep the city breathing without panic. Administration also began to change. Now there was a center. There was someone who united the captaincies, who received news, who gave orders, who analyzed cases. For the first time, the colony had a kind of brain. A tired brain, sure, but functioning. The captaincies that had sunk became a subject. Those that were working became examples. Those that were confused, well, they remained confused, but at least now they had someone to complain to. And the most curious thing is that little by little, the presence of the general government began to alter the landscape. The villages ceased being so isolated, communication routes improved, commerce gained rhythm, security increased a little, not much, but enough for people to start believing that perhaps, just perhaps, Brazil could turn into something beyond a patchwork of desperate pieces. Tomé de Souza also dealt with internal conflicts. Colonists against colonists, local authorities against donataries, donataries against their own administrative incapacity. He wrote letters, scolded people, made inspections, organized expeditions. Continuous, tiring, slow work, the type of function no one should assume without prior warning. He assumed it anyway, probably thinking it would be simpler. It wasn't. It never was. And of course, the climate continued being the enemy. The construction of Salvador faced sun, mud, storms, heat, tool wear, lack of labor. The body tired, the wood warped, the mud ran down the walls. It was like assembling a city on terrain that was always trying to undo everything during the night. But Tomé remained stubborn, and stubbornness in the colony was a virtue. Work with native peoples also transformed. With the Jesuits, there were now intermediaries who better understood cultural complexity. Alliances were reorganized, conflicts were negotiated, relations became less improvised, not out of perfection, but out of experience. It was like finally reading a few pages of a book whose cover you had been judging without understanding. And this set of actions, defense, religion, administration, reorganization, began to produce an effect. Slow, gradual, tired, but an effect. For the first time, it seemed Brazil could be governed for real, that there was direction, structure, planning, not perfect, of course, never would be, but sufficient to prevent the repetition of the most basic errors. And Portugal, far away, breathed relieved. Finally, something seemed to work. The letters that arrived spoke of construction, adjustment, improvement. They also spoke of fever, heat, problems, but that was already expected. The important thing was that now there existed someone capable of answering. Tomé de Souza didn't solve everything. No one would solve it, but he started what had been missing since 1530, continuity, a common thread, a logic, a minimal organization that would allow Brazil to stop being just land Portugal occupies and start becoming an administered territory, even if based on sweat. And so, after 2 decades of tired experiments, the colony finally gained breath. Not comfort. Comfort didn't exist, but breath. And it is here, in this beginning of fragile order, that the mess begins to be organized, or something close to that. And although Tomé de Souza had begun to pull the colony toward some type of order, tired order, tropical order, order that slips with the rain, this didn't erase the fact that the first 20 years of European settlement in Brazil had been basically a long test of patience, a test for the body, for the mind, for clothes, for the roof, and even for common sense. Spoiler, a good part of this common sense survived. But even in this hot, humid, and always slightly chaotic scenario, there was something curious: persistence. The type of persistence that only appears when going back home would be more tiring than staying in the wrong place. And the colonists, already adapted to the heat that stuck, the nights full of noise, and the food that never had the same flavor twice, began to realize that Brazil wasn't exactly becoming easier. They were the ones getting more trained. That in itself was a miracle, not a religious miracle with fireworks in the sky. It was a practical, discrete miracle that only happens when an entire community spends enough time suffering together. The heat didn't seem so aggressive anymore, the mud didn't seem so deep, manioc didn't seem so mysterious, even the mosquitoes seemed less hostile. Not because they bit less, but because the colonists didn't even feel the difference between itch, sweat, and annoyance anymore. Colonial life went on slow, dragging, repetitive, but it went on. And it is funny to realize how at some moment the impossible becomes daily. Crooked houses became normal, mud walls became part of the landscape, smoke on the ceiling became part of the decoration, forest noises became the soundtrack. The colonist didn't wake up scared anymore. He just woke up tired. And that is almost comfort, if you think about it. And even so, Brazil continued reminding them all the time that any sensation of stability was temporary. Just one heavier rain for the roof to give way. Just one oversight to lose half the crop. Just one fever to knock someone down for days. It was like that. 2 steps forward, 1 back, 1 to the side, a stumble, and then everything started again. Tropical math was never kind, but at the same time, it was this imperfect life that held the colony together because no one was there for comfort. They were there for survival, for imposition, for unlikely opportunity, or, in some cases, for lack of choice. And this peculiar mixture of motives transformed into a strange type of community, a community molded by discomfort. And you, listening to this story, might be realizing now that the Brazil of the beginning of colonization wasn't made of heroic triumphs, nor grand constructions. It was made of error, heat, attempt, mosquitoes, improvisation, more error, more improvisation, and a patience bordering on the absurd. It was a slow, tired construction, full of stumbles, but even so, it was a construction. And that, in the end, is what matters. And it is at this point that the narrative begins to unravel, not as an epic finale, but as a natural exhaustion, because everything that happened between 1530 and 1549, the captaincies, the crooked villages, the aggressive climate, the fragile relations, the conflicts, the French, the regretful donataries, the general government arriving, all this creates a clear image. Brazil wasn't born ready. It was born hot, humid, noisy, and unfinished. And honestly, that part hasn't changed much yet. But there is something comforting in that, in the fact that even with so many mistakes, so many failures, and so many sleepless nights, there was always someone trying one more time. The colonist woke up tired and tried. The donatary, even confused, tried. Tomé de Souza, even exhausted, tried. Even the Jesuits tried with patience that to this day no one knows where it came from. The truth is that the entire colony was moved by this verb, to try. And trying, repeated for decades, becomes history, becomes a city, becomes a country, becomes memory, even if the memory smells of smoke, sweat, and poorly toasted manioc. And now, at the end of this tired story, you can perceive that surviving in Brazil between 1530 and 1549 required more than strength. It required a special type of resistance. Resistance to heat, to humidity, to loneliness, to the unknown. Resistance to one's own tiredness. Perhaps that is why so many people fall asleep listening to these stories, because the body recognizes this rhythm, this slow drag, this soft struggle against sleep that arrives slowly like a calm tide. And it is here that your night meets theirs. A silent meeting where the tropical past, noisy and uncomfortable, begins to dissolve in your mind, while the narrative gets slower, lower, more monotonous, and you begin to feel that good tiredness, that weight in the eyes, that soft invitation to stop thinking about the heat, the mud, the mosquitoes and the manioc, and let only the silence work. Because in the end, every boring story for sleeping works like this. We take you along long paths, full of details, full of tiredness, until tiredness itself becomes the bed. So now is just letting the mind empty a little, letting the weight of the day drain away, like rain drained through the colonial villages, letting the body sink not in mud, but in repose, and letting this sensation of sleep arrive without haste. As the humid breeze of tropical dawns arrived, which didn't refresh anything, but at least warned that the day was over. And with this, we close this tired journey through the beginning of the settlement of Brazil. A crooked start, hot, difficult but real, and above all, full of humanity. That humanity that errs, insists, stumbles, and in the end, simply continues. Good night, tired listener, and until next time, sleep with a boring story.